So I've got a very special guest on today, Ariel, who is the host of the Malice podcast, a very successful podcast, and she's based over in Texas. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. We're going to jump right into it, if that's okay with you. So
absolutely.
It's very brave of you to talk about your mental health experiences so openly. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about your diagnosis and what that means to you?
Sure. So I went for many years where I was improperly diagnosed, and it didn't do much to help, really. I found out, I guess, when I was 31, I was diagnosed with bipolar 1. And then I have comorbid diagnoses with obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And for me, it was a game changer because once I had those things, once I had a name, once I had a title, once I had that information that I could look up, that I could have explained, it could be properly treated. And I also just got a better understanding and contextualization for things I'd experienced for a really long time that didn't make sense to me.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, it basically is just one of those things that was really helpful in my case. So.
And do you have any ideas of why you were misdiagnosed? Was it simply because the clinicians didn't really know what they're doing, or was it because your presentation was confusing? What were the factors?
Well, it's really interesting that you asked me that, because I, for years, people thought that I dealt with general anxiety disorder and depression. And those things can often be mistaken, I guess. But no one ever suggested that I could potentially have bipolar disorder. And so what was, I guess, manifesting as I guess, anxiety from people who were treating me was actually, I guess, manic episodes. And then when I would go into those depression, like the depressive slumps, I mean, for somebody with bipolar 1, they're a lot more dysthymic. So they're not as low as somebody who, for instance, has bipolar 2. So, so they just thought in general, I just had like general depression and general anxiety. And so I was treated for those things, and it just wasn't very effective.
And do you mind please describing for the viewers what it's like to be in a manic episode, what you remember the most?
Oh my goodness. So you can...
Big question, I know.
It is a big question, but I think it's an important one.
Sure.
Basically, when you are in a manic episode, you can feel anxiety. You can feel that kind of, it's not a fear. It's just sort of like a trepidation, I guess. But there's also this feeling of being very high and very excitable. And, it can be kind of a coin toss between excited and irritable. But, for me, for instance, I was never into like drugs or anything like that, but I would go on like shopping binges where I would just spend money whether I had it or not. And, and it would meet that sort of immediate need, but there wasn't exactly any sort of long-term payoff.
Okay. And I've heard that before. That's quite common to be impulsive and to spend money excessively. While you were talking about your experience, it made me wonder. I can understand that if somebody's clearly in a phase of depression, then they want to change. If they have insight, they want to feel better. They want to feel different. Mm-hmm. My question for you is that if you're in a manic episode, then if you have an elated mood, is there much insight and is there much motivation to actually want it to stop or not?
Not always. I do think there are times when, for instance, now, if I recognize that I'm having a manic episode, I know it's not a good thing. And so I'm more inclined to want that to cease. But before, basically, it was kind of There would be times when well, for instance, like insomnia, I couldn't sleep, and I had, a diminished appetite and things like that. And it is frustrating in some ways.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. And if you don't mind me asking, what did it feel like when you were down, when you were low? I'm not just talking about the symptoms. I mean, actually, what did it feel like internally?
Oh, there's just kind of a hopelessness that sets in. This feeling that anything that you're doing is not worth it. It doesn't matter. It's not going to change anything. You feel like you've let people down. It's really just kind of an overwhelming sadness. I think of Breakfast at Tiffany's when Audrey Hepburn asks, "Have you ever had a case of the mean reds?" And the response is, "The reds, you mean like the blues?" And she says, "No, the blues are when you're sad. That's all. The mean reds are when, you're scared of something, but you don't know what you're scared of." And that's really kind of resonated with me over the years.
Okay. So it sounds like low mood and sadness is on the normal spectrum of what everybody experiences, but what you're talking about is a completely different beast, right? It goes beyond that, it sounds like.
Okay. Right. If you can pinpoint what's making you sad or what's making you scared, then it is completely normal. But if there's no reason for it, then it's something that's pervasive in your life.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be walking through life feeling like you're grieving all the time. So,
and I imagine that if, as you said yourself, if there's not an identifiable reason for it, then that makes it harder for other people to really understand and show empathy.
Exactly. Yes.
Have you had much experience of stigma or of people not being particularly supportive at all?
That's a difficult question to answer because there are people who want to be supportive but don't know how. And there are definitely, sorry, my cat is participating. But yeah, there are definitely people who want to be supportive and don't know how. There are definitely people who are very supportive, and then there are also others that just, they don't understand, they don't get it, and in some ways they get angry about it because it doesn't make sense to them because they don't feel that way.
And do you feel like they're angry at you, or they're just angry at the situation of the illness?
I think probably a little of both. In general, I don't, I mean, 99% of things I don't take personally. I feel like somebody else's reaction to something is their reaction to something. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with me. But they may think that it's personal. They may think that it's something that I should feel bad about, or something that I should be doing to fix it, when it's not something that necessarily can be fixed the way that we think of it. Right. So
I'm quite interested in your experience and your opinions on the healthcare system and the people that the professionals that you got support from in was it all in Texas where you're?
Yes, that's correct.
I think it's fair to say that from my personal experience, a lot of the people that I have contact with, either my own patients or just friends and family, generally, unfortunately, are not that happy with the treatment they've received in the UK. I think there's lots of reasons for that we don't have time to go into, but the NHS being so stressed and pressure on services. So I'm just wondering, what was your overall experience of being treated by professionals in Texas?
Until I received my diagnosis at 31, I was not very happy with the individuals that I'd seen. There was kind of a coldness about it. And I'm talking about people who are in private practice. So we're not talking people who are working, in the ER or anything like that. You know, I just think almost, I don't know, they just kind of seemed jaded or not terribly interested in what was happening. And when you go in to see somebody about these things, you're feeling the absolute most that you can. Like the emotions are the highest rank. And when somebody seems disinterested, it's it's not validating. Does that make sense?
You know what? It absolutely makes sense. Especially when I was a junior doctor and I used to do lots of different rotations and move teams every few months. I've certainly worked with some very good staff, but I on more than one occasion I've worked with some members of staff who don't really seem very empathetic at all, and they seem, to be blunt, irritated by being bothered, and a lot of it seems to do with target chasing, seeing people within a certain amount of time, or just moving them on to the next service.
Right.
I've often seen members of staff who don't really take ownership of trying to help clients or patients. So I can absolutely resonate with what you're saying, but it does bring up the question of why go into that line of work in the first place.
Right. Which is, to some extent, I can see how it would be fascinating, but in so many cases, I would be told, here's a referral to a counselor, as if like they don't personally need to be connected to what's happening. Like their job is just to, let me diagnose you, let me get you medication, get out of my face. Like, and so, I think there may be a theoretical component there that's fascinating, like knowing the medical side of things and, being able to think about like how these disorders play out, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But not really that, I guess, bedside manner, if we're going to put it just very in lay terms, I guess.
Yeah. So it sounds like some professionals, and again, I think we're both saying not all, but some professionals are more interested in the actual disorders and the disease rather than the people.
And that was the big, I guess, game changer for me is when I saw my psychiatrist. She was brand new to me, and she was a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and she decided, okay, well, since this hasn't been working for over a decade, why don't we try something else? This could be what's happening. Have you ever been treated for bipolar disorder? And she was the kind of person that, like, when I would leave appointments, we'd hug. Like, it was, she was wonderful. And she ended up having to retire for health reasons. She referred me to the psychiatrist I see now. And she's the same way. She's just, call me by my first name. Let's chat. How's your daughter? What's going, you know what I mean? Like there's an interest in my life. She actually listens to my podcast, which is kind of wild. I'm not sure if it's because she likes it or if she just wants more insight. But,
well, she's keeping tabs on you.
Exactly. Yeah, no, but she's wonderful. So,
this
really,
thing that you're talking about, this trait of being personable, it's not something in my view that can ever really be taught. You either have it or you don't. So you could be the most experienced nurse, psychologist, psychiatrist, but if you don't, you can't be taught how to care. That's what I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So please, Ariel, do you mind telling us a bit about how you look after your mental health now? What do you do now that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of doing a decade ago?
Sure. So I've had to learn to set boundaries. That's been a big thing for me. I'm one of those people, I've always wanted to just help. And so saying no was really hard for me. I felt like if I'm capable of it, I should say yes, whether or not it's good for me or not. So, so that's been a big thing for me is just learning that my time is valuable too. And sometimes it's okay to just say, I really don't have the bandwidth, or I'm sorry, I can't right now. And you don't necessarily owe anybody an explanation. That's a big thing too, is people will say, well, if I say no, I need to have a really good reason. No, you really don't. I mean, your good reason can be just, I'm looking after my own mental health. You don't owe that to anybody. So I think that's important. I also, I box and I do yoga. So just
not at the same time, I hope.
It would be weird if I did. But no, I really do. I enjoy them for very different reasons. Yoga is very centering, very calming. Boxing is like dancing, except hitting things. So, but basically getting to a place where you're engaged in some kind of activity, it helps to get out a lot of that sort of anxious energy. So that's been very, very helpful for me. And I make time to spend with my daughter. That's not, we don't get a ton of time together, at least as far as I'm concerned, but I make sure that it's quality when we do. So even if it's just a couple hours in the evening, it's time that, she and I bond and we laugh together and we have good times and we snuggle and all those good things. So.
Well, it really sounds like you've made a lot of, you put a lot of time and attention into making sure that all of your areas of your life that you can control are sorted out.
Mm-hmm.
It's very impressive.
Thank you. Yeah. It's taken a long time.
And yeah, I can imagine it has. And am I right in thinking that you used to be a mental health professional yourself? Did I get that right?
Okay. So I worked with emotionally disturbed children for a period of time. And then I worked within the child welfare system in Tarrant County, which is where I live. I was part of the committee that basically put together the Safe Baby Court system, which is for infants and toddlers and child welfare. So I have an infant mental health endorsement. And I technically am a qualified mental health professional, but I wasn't trained to be any kind of clinician or anything. My background, my doctoral work is in sociological social psychology. So.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to come to that next, actually. So I know you've got a bachelor's degree in psychology, master's in sociology. You've done some doctoral work on social psychology.
That's correct.
Did I get that right?
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've got quite an inclination towards how the human mind works, and obviously from your podcast, you can see that you're very much into true crime. I think I have something similar to you. I think yours is more developed than mine. I think I'm quite new to the world of true crime. My question is, what draws you, or what draws us, but specifically you, into this world, do you think?
It started very young for me. My mother told me that as a child, even as a very young child, I had a very strong sense of justice, wanting justice. I wouldn't have put it in those terms, of course, at that age, but I would see somebody, for instance, in the winter who was homeless, and I would want to give them my coat because they looked cold, right? And I was in this warm car, and it just made sense to me. So when I was 7, I read Lois Lowry's Number the Stars, and something clicked in me that was like, what is so terrible that this child was taken away from her parents, has to pretend to be somebody else. Her parents are who knows where, and she has to be basically smuggled across a water channel to another country in order to be safe. And from there, I got more and more interested in learning about what eventually I would find out, the Holocaust and Nazi war crimes. And then when I was 9, I loved to read when I was a kid. I still do, but I picked up a couple books when I was 9, and they were Be the Judge, Be the Jury books. And one of them was about 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜𝐡, who is, he was tried and convicted for treason in the United States in the 60s. And then the other was the trial of Lizzie Borden. And these are great kids' books, by the way. So I opened it up, and, you know, sometimes you have like the copyright page and then the title page and what have you. And then there'll just be a picture. And the picture before the chapter started was of Andrew Borden with his face obliterated on the couch. And I had one of those, as we call them in the US at least, murderino moments, where I just kind of went, oh my God, that's terrible. Keep going. Like, I've got to know everything now. And, you know, so from there, it just kind of took off. And I think by the time I was really invested in true crime, I'd already been doing it for so long. I was an actress for a number of years, about 20 years. Oh, wow. And in that, you have to have a real sense of empathy to try to understand who you're conveying. And then when I was in school, when I was doing sociology and social psychology, I focused on identity development and maintenance. And my interest really was mostly in deviant behavior and social control. And so I think that directly feeds in to true crime. It's the people who don't fit the norm that really interest me the most. So,
okay, that is very interesting. I have the same kind of obsession of people who don't fit the norm. Yeah, I think my inclination's more towards kind of mental illness, but I'm starting to come around to true crime. And I didn't realize how popular it is. It's almost a movement. There's just so many podcasts. There's like convention shows. Yeah, it's a world out there.
I think a big part of that is just that it started to be destigmatized. I mean, since the dawn of humanity, we've had a fascination with true crime. We just haven't called it that. You know, it's once we went from the state of total war where we were all out for number one, and we started to kind of make those, I guess, sacrifices, if you want to put it that way, in order to become a community. You know, we had to give up a lot of those things that were very self-serving, and we had to have a way to police those who were not benefiting the community. Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's been a fascination all along. It's just right now people are going, oh, it's okay to be interested in this. Yeah. So
I think if you look at Netflix, the number of documentaries about everything from serial killers to psychoanalytical documentaries to Mindhunter, etc., there seems to be a massive sort of spurt of interest. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it is quite recent. I don't remember 10, 15 years ago that this would be something popular that would be on TV.
No, I mean, aside from things like Forensics Files or Unsolved Mysteries, but those
were the X-Files.
X-Files, yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your podcast, please, Ariel. What drove you to start it in the first place?
Sure. Okay, so I am late to the game in podcasting, to be honest with you. I started July 2nd of 2019. That was my launch date. And basically, there was just, when I first started getting into it, it was sort of a substitute for documentaries, which I'm a huge documentary junkie. But when I learned that you could carry the documentary with you in your ears wherever you're going, it was, a pretty big deal to me. And basically, I would listen to a ton of true crime because it fascinates me. I'm also really, really interested in history, and I feel like a big overlap there too, and philosophy. And so there were these things that I wanted to tie together, in terms of psychology, sociology, all of this stuff. I wanted to understand what motivates these individuals to do the things that they do. And I couldn't find it. It could be out there. It might be, but I couldn't find it. And so I finally decided, well, if I can't find excuse me, if I can't find the podcast that I want to listen to, I'm going to have to make it myself. Exactly.
And how did you find the process of starting it in the first few months? So I suppose in a roundabout way, I'm asking you if there are any specific hurdles that you have, or if you've got any advice for anybody that's either just started or is thinking of starting a podcast.
Sure. Okay. So when I first started out, I was really lucky because my husband and I both had been musicians and recording artists. And so we already had a lot of good equipment, which is great because that's a big hurdle for people. A lot of people have to start out, podcasting straight onto their phones or onto their laptops and using equipment there. And that's fine. I would say the most important thing for people who are starting out, have content, know what you want to do, know what you want to talk about. There is an actress, and I'm not going to name her just because I think she's great, but she started a podcast and her very first episode was like, okay, guys, what do you want me to talk about? And it was like, kind of need to have that, in the chamber before you get into it. But yeah, if you bring content, the rest of it will follow. I would stress, get on social media as quickly as possible, because the more active you are there, the more people you're going to meet, the better networks you're going to form. I didn't do that. In the first 6 months that I had a podcast, I was not on social media like at all. And as soon as I did, I jumped from, I think when I started 6 months in, I had 45,000 downloads. And within the first month on social media, it jumped 20,000. So it's really, really important. So I definitely would do that. The other thing that I would do, and a lot of people feel like, things like Patreon, which is, for anybody who's not familiar, who's just getting into it, Patreon is a site where people can pay more or less like a donation, and they get, whatever, ad-free episodes or bonus content, things like that. It's whatever you really want to offer, honestly. And you can have different tiers for them to, to donate. And people think, well, I'm not big enough to have one, or I'm not there yet, or whatever. But the fact is, and this is just like completely from the heart, you don't know who out there wants to support you. And by not having that option, you're taking that option away from them. Yeah. So get it up immediately. The second you start, put up a Patreon, because there will be people who will be interested to do that. And once you start making an income from what you're doing, it's a real big like push forward in terms of like, oh, people like my stuff. Let's do this. So yeah, I mean, those would really be the big things for me.
Okay, that's really helpful. Me and Bethany are new podcast makers, so
right.
I hope you're taking notes, Bethany. My next question, Ariel, might sound a bit odd, but do you think there's something therapeutic about studying gruesome murders or really repugnant behavior? So another way to ask that question is, do you think there's any link between your own experiences of mental health issues and the interest that you've got, or do you think it would have been there anyway? Oh, no, I think just... Bless you. Sorry, I've needed a cough from it. So... No, I think that there's definitely a tie-in. And it's not just with mental illness. I mentioned that I have a diagnosis. It's actually complex PTSD. And there are certain things that in experiencing trauma, right, it's basically rocking you to your core. And it can rewire the way things work. And so I think, when you deal with something like, for instance, sexual assault, there's sort of a reclamation to an extent if you're looking into cases where there is an element of sexual assault, for instance. You're able to control, I guess, like your consumption of that, as opposed to not being in control if it's happening to you. Does that make sense? Yeah, my interpretation of that, and tell me if I've got this wrong, is that
Sure.
because you're examining a case with a bit of distance, you can't control the case itself, but you can kind of control how you look at it.
Yes.
Yeah, as opposed to the opposite of that happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there is something too about looking at extremes in general. You know, coming at this from a background in social service, which is most of what I've done in my life career-wise, there's kind of an element of what works for the most extreme or the biggest outliers is probably going to be best practice for everyone. And so there's a part of me that's like, okay, I need to examine the people who are so pathological or so outside of the norm in order to better understand myself and in order to better understand others with mental illness and neurotypical people. I mean, it's just, it's extremely helpful. And most of the communities I've worked with are that extreme outlier. You know, so yeah, once again, I just think that it helps to understand the human condition in general.
Okay. You mentioned complex PTSD about a minute or two ago. Do you mind please explaining for the viewers who might not know what that is and how it's different from your bog standard PTSD?
Gosh, I don't know that I can. Is that terrible?
Shall I tell you my understanding and you can tell me if this resonates?
That would be, that would be great. I'm sorry.
No, it's quite all right. I put you on the spot there. So my understanding is that post-traumatic stress disorder usually comes from one, or if you're particularly unlucky, then a couple of very significant, very extremely distressing, potentially life-threatening events, whereas complex PTSD is more of a series of events that happen over a long period of time. So rather than the body reacting to one incident, it's just incident after incident after incident, and the way it presents is more fragile.
Right. Yeah.
I sorry, you were about to say something?
Oh no, I just you know, I do. You said very unlucky. I have been in a position where I have, as an adult, experienced sort of a series of, I feel like Lemony Snicket here, a series of unfortunate events that have, they've created kind of a fragility that is not as common with run-of-the-mill PTSD, not to diminish PTSD at all. The experience is horrifying. I went from PTSD to complex PTSD. So, yeah.
Okay. I don't want to ask you about those experiences because I think that's a bit personal, but instead, if you don't mind, I might ask you how it impacts your life. So if, for example, if it varies from day to day, what kind of, if there's any triggers or if there's any specific symptoms that affect you?
I'm very open on my show about things that have happened. And I work with, for instance, I'm on the board of directors for a national nonprofit that works with survivors of domestic violence. But I feel like destigmatizing things like mental illness and experiences like sexual assault, et cetera, are very, very important. And so I'm really open about my own experiences. They're awful. And, you know, but okay. So what was the question again?
No, that's quite all right. Basically, I don't want to be too forward, so I don't want to.
Sure.
I don't want to ask anything that you're uncomfortable answering. So I was just hoping you'd give us a bit of an insight of what it's like to cope with more complex PTSD,
right, okay.
how it affects you. So if it helps, we had a gentleman called John Clark who
I listened to the interview.
And one thing that really struck me was that he said that he could be living a completely normal day, and then out of the blue he might be in a supermarket and he gets intrusive memories or flashbacks of a traumatic event. So it's like he was functioning and then all of a sudden he's just overwhelmed.
Right.
So that was really interesting to me.
It's really the hardest thing about it, I guess, is you don't know what's going to trigger you necessarily. There are certain things you can pick up on and go, okay, that's definitely a trigger. I need to avoid that. But sometimes it's a smell, sometimes it's a sound, sometimes it's, it can be a person who resembles someone. It's really hard to know. There was a moment where I had to pull over on the highway in the midst of a full-on panic attack because I saw the same type of car that a person had driven. And it was the same type and it was the same color and it's an unusual car. And I was just like, I couldn't, it was so jarring, and where the person I was with was like, what is going on? And I was like, that car, like just, completely overwhelmed. And they were like, who cares? It's just a car. Like, that's not this person. It's not, and I was like, this isn't a rational thing. You have to understand. And that's one of the things I really want to drive home with people is that you can't rationalize your way out of mental illness or any type of episode. You can understand it as fully as a person can understand, but it's not something that you can apply logic to when you're in the midst of it. So, there are things like panic attacks. There are things like, those moments. In some cases, I'll be triggered and can't get out of bed. Like anywhere. I have a weighted blanket. And it's one of those things where it's like, I need my weighted blanket. And if I, it's like a kid in a blankie, you know what I mean? Like you just have those moments where it's like, I need my safe place and this is my safe place. So, and sometimes it's as easy as, this is going to sound terrible. I know it is, but, at this point in time, I guess I am kind of recognized as a public figure. And when you get some real weird emails sometimes. Okay. And those can be triggering from time to time.
Okay. Do you mean like intentionally malicious emails? Like,
more like pictures.
Oh, really?
Welcome pictures, as I'm going to refer to them as.
Very diplomatic way of, I think you're saying dick pics.
Yeah, straight up dick pics. Yep. So, but yeah, when the reason people send those is out of sort of a malicious intent. They might not recognize it, but the fact is they want to make somebody uncomfortable. They want to do, they want to exercise that kind of control. And it is a trigger for me. A lot of people are just like, who cares? It doesn't always get me, but it does sometimes. So,
but you can't really say who cares unless you've been through those kind of experiences. Nobody will really know what it's like.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it sounds like if there are so many potential things that can trigger you, that must make you quite vulnerable because you can't predict what car you're going to see or who's going to send you emails. It must be really hard to cope with.
It is, there is definitely, I would say, a fragility and a vulnerability, but it's another big reason why I'm very open about my experiences in terms of what I've been through, as well as mental health issues, because there's a good friend of mine actually described me as being like the most vulnerably tough person they know. And I just thought, I kind of like that, you do kind of develop a toughness, if you really are willing to own what you go through. And the more open you are about it, and the more, people are willing to open up about those things. And I think we need a cultural shift that way, know. While there's stigma, people aren't going to seek help. It's the same thing with like drug abuse, If we continue to stigmatize drug abuse, then people are going to avoid going to rehab because they're going to think
absolutely.
it's admitting there's something wrong with them. And the fact is with mental illness, it's not that something's wrong with you, it's that you're suffering and you need help.
Yeah.
So
I couldn't agree more. I think it's what you said is really important. I think that there needs to be a space where people are welcome to talk about their experiences. And the more that we talk about it, the more it normalizes it, and it gives people permission almost, or courage to talk about their own experiences without being judged. I also think, I've mentioned this before on other episodes of my podcast, I think stigma has improved to a degree, and more people, celebrities especially, have come out to talk about their experiences, which is a good thing. But I think that it tends to be for illnesses like anxiety and depression, sometimes not the more severe kind of illnesses like schizophrenia, like complex PTSD. Certainly. And it's good that celebrities are talking about those things. I'm not saying it's not, but I think the problem is there's a risk that it might isolate people with even worse experiences even more. Sure. Because if everybody's talking about mental illness, but it is this mental illness that they've overcome, that's a version where everybody experiences anxiety and depression, then everybody seems to understand that, but will they understand what I'm going through? So I completely agree. I think it's very important.
I think that, a big relevant person right now who's dealing with more severe mental illness is Kanye West. And, it's kind of heartbreaking to me that people are so willing to just chalk it up and say, oh, he's crazy. Oh, he's, whatever, because it's like, he's in need of help. I mean, I'm not a diagnostician. I don't know what's happening there, but it's very, very clear that he has a supportive familial system, which is great. But anyone can be affected. Anyone. It doesn't divide up or choose, by class or by sex or by race or anything like that. Anyone can suffer. So, anyway, I would encourage people not to use that language and not to chalk somebody up as being, quote, crazy or a quote unquote psycho. Those terms are really disparaging. And that's another reason why people don't go and seek help.
Yeah. And I completely agree. And I think another issue is mixing up just intentional odd behavior or just being a bit kooky with actual mental illness, which is completely different. And I think if you don't make that distinction, then it's actually, it contributes towards stigma of mental illness, I think.
Absolutely. And, I see a lot of people conflate different types of like mental illness. There seems to be a mental illness du jour, right? One of the big ones lately that I've heard, at least here, is everybody's bipolar.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, as somebody who has bipolar, first of all, I'm not bipolar. I have bipolar disorder. Let's make that clear. It's not my identity. But, in addition to that, it's like you can't just put a blanket diagnosis as a lay person on any behavior that's unusual. Exactly what you were saying. There's a difference between being eccentric or quirky or kooky and actually suffering from a mental illness or disorder. So,
yeah. I think lots of people naturally have mood swings, and that gets labeled as bipolar, but that's actually disrespectful, I think, to people who do have bipolar, because
I agree.
You're minimizing a very difficult experience that people are going
through. And I mean, there's a huge difference, between having mood swings. If we are talking about somebody who's up and down on a dime, it's basically the opposite of bipolar when you go through these, really, you can go weeks to months where you're more or less manic and then back down. We're talking more something like if you did actually have some sort of disordered thinking, and this would be more of a personality disorder, but it would be more like borderline personality disorder, right? Absolutely. Which would be that hair trigger, basically. So
you're exactly right. Borderline, one of the features is an unstable variable mood, but that's different from periods of depression and mania and
exactly.
Absolutely. Ariel, just to go back a little bit onto your kind of your area of expertise and
Sure.
in studying criminality, and also your podcast. Is there any cases, either one or two cases or one specific case, that has either stood out to you or emotionally you felt more connected to than any other case?
I have three that are very, very difficult for me. They're the ones that haunt me. All three involve women, and not a single one is a serial killing situation, which a lot of people think, okay, I have a true crime podcast. I talk about cases that are resolved for the vast majority. And so they think, okay, serial killers. And the first that I'll talk about is the case of 𝐘𝐨𝐮𝐓𝐮, who was on her way home from the bar that she managed. It was 2:00 in the morning, and this guy had seen her at a stoplight, and he followed her, and he attacked her, and somebody across the street yelled at him to leave her alone, and so he vamoosed. And she was stumbling around, and people assumed she was just drunk or that there was something going on. She'd been stabbed, and she was able to get into a building's lobby, but the door to get into the hallway was locked. And this guy, 10 minutes later, realized no police are on the scene, nothing's going on. So he found her, and he raped her and killed her. And it was this horrific thing because everybody thought that 38 people had witnessed this and no one had done anything. And the fact is her death basically was turned into an agenda, a moralistic agenda, saying, we've lost our ability to have compassion and all of these things. And the fact of the matter is that the people had been doing things. No one had physically run across the street, but that was, they'd done everything else that they could, calling police and all this. It was before emergency number here. So they kind of had to triage what was going on. And so the people who were calling in, it sounded like it's a domestic dispute. The guy's already left. It's not, so they just kind of put it lower on the scale. But that one sticks with me. Oh God, it's terrible. The gang rape turned murder of Jodi Singh, which was just horrific. I won't go into the details of that, but that is one that if somebody wants to look into, there's a wonderful documentary called India's Daughter, I believe. And
yes, yeah.
She's just an incredibly heroic person, and what happened to her should not happen to anyone. And it breaks my heart that the youngest of the offenders is now free and walking the streets after 3 years in prison, which is very, very hard to think about. But the last one actually is the biggest one that hurts me, and one that I actually carry the victim's picture in my phone and revisit it fairly often. And the 26th of this month will mark the 55th anniversary of her death. It's the case of Sylvia Likens, who was a 16-year-old child who endured torture murder by a woman who was supposed to be caretaking for her and her sister. And, one of the most horrific things about it is that she was so abused that the children in the neighborhood would come over. They'd be charged a nickel to be able to do things like put out cigarettes on her or throw her around. It's horrific. Yeah. But one of the things that's so impactful about it to me is that she willingly took on the abuse that her sister would have endured in order to save her sister. And till the very end, she never she never let her dignity drop. She was, she stood up for herself to the extent, basically, the saddest thing about it to me is basically that her body gave out before her spirit did. But that's also very, very empowering in a way. She was a hero. So.
Yeah. Wow. It sounds like we can learn a lot about just the human spirit and resilience from some of the victims of some of these
Absolutely.
horrific crimes. Okay.
Right.
Thank you for sharing those stories with us.
Certainly.
Before we finish, Ariel, can you please just tell us if there's anything unexpected that you've learnt in your journey? So what I mean by that is just something that the average viewer might not appreciate or know. So specifically from going through what you've been with your mental health issues in the past.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most unexpected things is when I first started to open up about those things, I was in undergrad. So I was about 20, I guess. And we had this area at the dorms that I lived in that was called Smoker's Corner. And that's where all the smokers would hang out. But it was also just like the social hangout. Like everybody, if you wanted to just be around people and chat and whatever, that's where we would go. And there was one day that somebody brought up, I don't know, they made a joke, I think, about rape. And I kind of went off on them, as I'm wont to do from time to time. And I basically, explained that, like, it's not funny. And when you say these things, there are real people affected. And I basically broke into my own experience. And once I did that, this person looked like a deer in headlights. Like, okay, I said the worst thing ever, which rightfully so. But that said, I was approached by at least 20 women after that, who told me things about their childhoods, about their experiences in college that they'd never told anyone before, just because I'd shared mine. And they were like, oh my God, I'm not the only one. And that's the thing, is that you're not the only one. No matter what you've been through, no matter what your diagnosis is, there's a reason there's a diagnosis. And that's because other people have dealt with the same issues. And so that's been really unexpected. And I guess, just, I don't know. I mean, the whole thing's a journey, isn't it? I mean, just kind of, I guess it's all unexpected. The one thing I think that's been the greatest continuity in my life has been I've never been prepared for anything that's come up. So.
Always expect the unexpected.
Right.
So thank you for bearing with us, Ariel. My final question to you, and you have kind of already answered this, I think, to a degree, would be if you've got any advice for anybody that's going through mental health issues. So you've already explained how you've managed to structure your own life and your activities, hobbies, spending time with your daughter, etc. So aside from what you've already said, anything else you can think of that might be helpful?
If somebody is going through mental health issues, I think the biggest thing that I would want to impart is you deserve to feel better. I feel like when you're in the throes of things, it's difficult to feel like you deserve to be better, never mind, do you think you can be, there's this sort of self-deprecating, like, I don't deserve it. And I keep using that word, but that really is kind of what it feels like. But the fact is that you do, and you can, So if you are dealing with something like that, go and find help. I mean, start out with a friend or a family member, somebody that you trust, but, work from there, because you should be able to experience life without suffering.
Yeah. That's very, very poignant words. Thank you for that, Ariel.
Oh, thank you.
I hope your words find their way to somebody that is in a similar situation that's watching this.
Yeah.
Ariel, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Your story is very interesting. And thank you very much for being a part of it.
Oh, this has been an absolute pleasure. I appreciate it so much. Thank you for having me.
I wish you all the best.
Oh, same.
Yeah, happy with that. You happy with that, Ariel?
I am. I'm sorry. I feel like I just talked your ear off.
No, that's what you're here for. Yeah, it was very interesting. Really good.
I'm not used to being on this side of the interview. So it was like, oh shit, people are asking me things. I better talk.
Thank you so much for watching that episode of A Psych for Sore Minds. Hope it was educational. Hope you managed to get something from it. Please, please, please do subscribe to my channel. Not only does it help me immeasurably, but it actually burns calories, thousands of calories. We are on most social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, you know the drill. Or if you have any ideas for any future Psych for Sore Minds episodes, you're very welcome to reach out and contact me directly. Our email address is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. So I hope you continue watching this channel. There's at least minimum one new video every week, usually on a Tuesday evening UK time. I am trying to do shorter, more frequent videos, so that's all work in progress. Anyway, take care of yourselves, and until next time, stay euthymic, homies.